Wow. It's been a wonderful forum, and I just feel so privileged to be able to live in a place where we have so many amazingly talented people. As Paul mentioned, I grew up in the American South. I grew up in Asheville, North Carolina. Many of you may know Asheville because it's become such a tourist mecca. I can guarantee you, when I grew up there in the 60s and 70s, it was nothing like it is now. And I can't tell you how many times growing up I would meet children my age. I left when I was 18. And I was met, if I ever said anything about being Jewish, I would be met with stares, but I thought Jews had horns. All kinds of interesting reactions. It was a heavily Baptist, Southern Baptist community, and I think it's pretty fundamentalist once you get outside the border of the city. And I have some stories about that. And I lived in various places around the city. It's quite different than now inside the city, which now has a reputation for being a mini Berkeley. So, with that in mind, we actually had a very strong Jewish community there. There were 2 synagogues. My family belonged to the Reform synagogue. We also had a conservative synagogue. There was no Orthodox. It was pretty tough to be Orthodox in Asheville, although there were some. And my family is almost all from the South. In fact, from the very deep South. Down in Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. My dad grew up in Alabama, in Dothan, Alabama. You can't get further south than that. And he went to military school. And he has told me just within the last 2 years just how tough that was. I really feel very privileged to have grown up when I did, because he suffered a lot of discrimination. My dad, to this day, and he's just turned 85, is what some people might call super Zionist on steroids. And all of my family is, except for my very immediate family of my 2 brothers and 1 cousin. So I'm considered an oddball in my family. And it's not just because of working with Jewish Voice for Peace. It's also because I work for the Environmental Protection Agency. For one thing, they're just amazed I would ever want to work for the government, and particularly for a regulatory agency. Almost all of them are small business people with their own little shops, with their own little businesses, and they hate, of course, government regulations. I had one relative when I went to visit her a few years ago down in New Orleans. When I told her I was there for an environmental justice conference, her reaction was, "Justice? What's that? I don't really like that word." I'm not doing it in the Southern accent I should be. And I lost my Southern accent. My family does have quite very Southern accents. But today, I wanted to talk a little bit about 2 things. One is what's happening in Israel, and especially since the re-election of Netanyahu, and some of the tensions going on there. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but just mention a little bit based on an article that just came out a week ago. And secondly, about the issue of civil rights. So I'm going to start with talking about this article that I happened upon. It was in Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, and it was by an Israeli named Tomer Persiko. He teaches religious studies at Tel Aviv University. And the name of the article was "The Disaster That Judaism Won't Survive." And in it he talks about the many journalists many Western journalists, like Dana Milbank from the Washington Post, Michael Cohen from the Boston Globe, Jonathan Friedland, senior editor and columnist for The Guardian, and even Thomas Friedman from the New York Times. How all of them and more, particularly since the re-election, once again, of Netanyahu. I don't know how many of you realize that Netanyahu is now the longest-serving prime minister in Israeli history. And what he talks about is how they all are saying that Israel can't survive as both a Jewish and democratic state. And he talks about how the majority of Israel's citizens don't believe that those two can exist simultaneously. In fact, both the Western world and in Israel, people now consider Judaism and democracy to be mutually exclusive entities. So it's quite scary. So I was also thinking about the title of today's forum, Palestine and Zion, the Journey for Civil Rights. And so I was thinking about this as, particularly last night, just last night, I was attending the 50th anniversary for the end of the Vietnam War. And that's actually also taking place today. And I'm hoping to catch some of that later today. And so I was thinking about this issue of civil rights versus human rights. And there is a very important distinction between those two terms. Now, human rights include the right to life, fair expression, education, protection from torture, fair trial, and so forth. They're the fundamental rights we have as human beings. And interestingly enough, they were conceived just after World War II, particularly in regard to the treatment of Jews and others under the Nazi regime. The UN, and I'm assuming most of you know this, but the UN adopted the Universal Declaration for Human Rights very soon after that, which cemented the foundation of human rights, international law, and policy. Now, on the other hand, civil rights are the rights provided by citizenship in a particular nation or state. So in the U.S., civil rights are protected under the U.S. Constitution. And one of the things that I remember most growing up in my family, while there wasn't a lot of emphasis, if any, on U.S. regulation of environmental laws, there was a lot of attention placed on Jewish grounding in a reverence for law, that concept of how important it is in the law. And in fact, my mother, to her dying day, kept hammering home, why in the world is there not one attorney or doctor in our family? It's really frustrating. But so be it. So if you look at Israeli law, back to the very beginning, back in 1950, soon after the establishment of the country, there were laws already being put in place that started out as quite discriminatory. One, for instance, is the Law of Return in 1950 that entitles all Jews anywhere in the world to immediately come to Israel and enjoy Israel's legal and political rights. It's only for Jews. That's not the case for non-Jews. And in fact, in 1952, there was a law passed called the Citizenship Law. it established a two-tiered legal system, which holds that Jews are provided nationality rights and citizenship, whereas indigenous Palestinians and all others, all non-Jews, can only hold citizenship. So already right there, that was established. The other thing that's so important is that there is no constitution in Israel. They rely on what they call the basic laws. Those are just two of the basic laws, and they keep building on them. So in more recent years, there have been even more laws instituted. Many of you have heard about the Nakba, so-called Nakba law, which there was just recently a Supreme Court a Supreme Court decision in Israel that ruled that it stands. And that makes it illegal for government programs and any of the institutions in Israel that receive funding from the government to allow for any mention of the Nakba, which, as most of you know, but probably not everybody, and I just really learned about it within about the last 5 to 7 years, that it is the Palestinians' catastrophe. So when Israel became a state and Jews, and it just, of course, just happened that, or it's happening now, in this period of time, that Jews are celebrating in Israel, I should say Israelis and many Jews are celebrating the independence of the state, and that is the Nakba for Palestinians. But we're not supposed to talk about that in Israel. Now, in addition, there's the many, many practices that are also very discriminatory and racist. So there's a whole separate and unequal education system. And everything is determined by religion. In fact, when you go to the airport, those of you who have been to Israel know, you are usually asked your religion. I have one friend who went with me, and when they asked for her religion and she said that she was Unitarian, they said, "What's that?" That's not a religion. So you're definitely classified. Certainly there is discrimination against the Ethiopian Jews, the African immigrants, and so forth that that Reverend Hagler spoke about so eloquently. And even among Jews, there is very much a class system. You have the Ashkenazi Jews, who are the European-based Jews, and that's where my family was descended from. But you also have the Sephardic Jews that came originally from Spain, and the Mizrahi Jews. A lot of people don't know about the Mizrahi Jews who came from the Arab countries, so they're really Arab Jews. And there has been discrimination ever since the beginning, when they all came together. So all that's going on. You also have the case where there is no civil marriage. And in fact, Orthodox Judaism is the official religion. So when my family grew up in the Reformed tradition, that's really not practiced there. Yes, some people practice it, but it's not formally recognized. And therefore, Reform Jewish weddings aren't even recognized. You can't do that. So you know what most Jews do in Israel? They have to leave Israel just to get married. When they come back, their marriages are recognized. But they can't even get married there. I mean, it's amazing. And people don't realize that even within, for the Jews there is discrimination. Another thing, I've been reading quite a bit about the Women of the Wall. This is a feminist organization. Most of them are Orthodox. And they go to pray at the Western Wall in Jerusalem, which is the holiest site for all of Judaism. And not only can they not read from the Torah or wear Jewish religious garments, they are not even allowed to sing. Because under Orthodox tradition, it's not in the law, but under Orthodox tradition, Orthodox men are not supposed to hear women singing, because heaven forbid It could be sensuous. It is. And it is. You are so right. So, and as we know, there is an entirely racist system when it comes to the occupied territories. Totally two-tiered legal system. The settlers, the Jewish settlers in the occupied territories in the West Bank, of course, get full rights under Israeli civil law. The Palestinians have to live with military orders. And military orders, by the way, become law for Palestinians whenever a military order is issued. And they're constantly being issued. And while under the Hague Convention, the military occupying power is supposed to address the economic welfare of the local population, as we well know, it's not. Israel is not doing what it's supposed to do, even under its military occupied system. So, back to this article that I was talking about, the one that's called "The Disaster That Judaism Won't Survive." So, the author of that ended the article by saying this: "The current debacle will become a historic disaster if, heaven forbid, Israel truly becomes exclusively Jewish in the future. When that happens, Judaism will become synonymous with apartheid and occupation, violence and oppression, despotism and subjugation. Judaism has survived many disasters. This is one disaster it will not survive." And, you know, Paul introduced me as being the chapter coordinator for Jewish Voice for Peace here in the DC area. So in Jewish Voice for Peace, we emphasize international law. Unfortunately, most, or at least many Israelis, think that international law is anathema. I consider that a crime in and of itself. Jewish Voice for Peace's mission states that we're inspired by Jewish tradition to work together for peace, social justice, equality, human rights, respect for international law, and a U.S. foreign policy based on these ideals. And we consider our job to be to focus on U.S. foreign policy, not on Israeli foreign policy per se, not on dictating what we think is a solution for the problem, but to maintain and to push the U.S. government to focus on international law, human rights, and equality. We're going to continue to do that, and we certainly welcome everyone to join in that struggle. I believe that everybody here is probably here because you do believe in that struggle. So thanks for being here, and we certainly look forward to answering any questions you've got.
Now, an opportunity for you to engage them and for them to engage you, clearly. So, any questions?
Thank you. My question is for Ms. Fudge. You said something that surprised me. You said that it is seen that Judaism and democracy are mutually exclusive, that it's coming to be seen that way, is that right?
Well, in Israel.
Okay, thank you.
I'm talking about Israel.
Okay.
That's the
Thank you, that clarifies it, because the article that Dana Milbank wrote was making the distinction between the Jewish state and democracy. Those
That's exactly what, yes,
Okay.
that's what I meant. Sorry
Gotcha.
if that was confusing.
Thank you very much.
I didn't get into the issue of the definition of Zionism and the difference between Judaism and Zionism. Unfortunately, in this country, and unfortunately throughout most of the world, it's equated. I mean, Judaism and Zionism. But that's certainly not what the case is, and it's certainly not what even was originally intended. I can say, for instance, that many of us who are working in the area of working toward social justice and equality and democracy do believe that there's a place, it makes sense, for Jews to be able to have a homeland in Israel-Palestine. But that's very different than the concept of nationalism and of a Jewish state. And in fact, many of those who started out as Zionists never even intended for there to be a Jewish state per se. But that's the way that it now has evolved into. And there are many Jews, well, I won't say a huge number, but there certainly are many of us, and particularly those who are in Jewish Voice for Peace and affiliated other organizations in the US, who are not so enamored with the concept of nationalism for Jews.
My name is Imam Ali, and as you receive the news from various parts of Palestine, you see that more and more children are being arrested, abused, tortured by IDF. The other thing which is a part of more young people now, their tendency is towards suicide in Palestine. I have recently did a free translation of 2 poems written by youth in Gaza. So I'd like to see Dr. Abdul Rahman and Shelley can make a comment about that.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand all that.
See, IDF policy has changed. Now they are arresting little children like 7 years old and torturing them and in the prison. And then there's also the rise in suicide by the Palestinian youth, especially in Gaza.
Maybe I can take over. This is a huge issue for Palestine. Actually, Mohammed Sarraj, Jamal, am I right? Sarraj, one of the most prominent psychologists on child trauma, just passed away. He was from Gaza. Researchers have been documenting this for many, many years, and especially in Gaza in particular, and among Palestinians. And we see it often from kids who come here from Palestine on scholarships, and then many of them are diagnosed with severe mental stress and STD and traumatic stress is really serious. I'm going to say this in a very, that's something that I have reflected on myself, is that in fact the entire Palestinian community is traumatized. I think children in particular are extremely vulnerable to what's happening around them. I have witnessed one child, well, he's not a child, he was 18 years old, came to college here, he was admitted to a mental institution here, right here in Bethesda. The Palestinian community made all the efforts to go meet him. Then he was returned by the school to Gaza through all kinds of struggles. But I knew once he got there, there was nothing for him anybody could do. But I would argue that my father struggles with a lot of the issues, the insecurities that we have, the fears that we have. the way that we see the world. And I also believe my husband, who's African American, has a lot of the symptoms that my family has in Palestine. Yeah, this kind of life is not easy. It's not easy to live under those conditions. It's not easy for a child, as Tarek just told you, to see his father with no power to protect him, to watch his mother helpless as a man who's 18 years old with a gun, doesn't brandish whatever he wants with his father, and the child knows that this man that is supposed to protect me, my father can't do nothing for me. And that's something that my husband has struggled with his father when racism was rampant in the United States, and still is. So those are really serious issues, but the level of heightened, like you can avoid it here in the United States. In Palestine you cannot. And that's why it's so drastic. But I agree with you, that is an issue that is of extreme importance. And it will play out in the life of a nation for a long time.
Yes, my name is Phil Portlock, and I'm just honored to be here today. It's a very important discussion. And I'm going to just say something, and maybe everyone may not know this, but I firmly believe that the chance for a two-state solution is gone. And what that does is to the state of, to Israelis, is that if you don't have a two-state solution where the Israelis and Palestinians are living side by side, as we've heard so often, how in the world are you going to have a Jewish state? When you have a whole issue of population growth in the Arab population, you just heard the last election where Netanyahu just came right out and said, the Arabs are coming to vote. He didn't expect to have an Arab bloc of votes. So I'm just throwing this question out to any of the panelists for you all to just maybe just give some enlightenment on that issue, because it just seems defeatist, and it just seems like it can't happen.
Yeah, and a lot of, well, it started out in intellectual circles, and on the ground that the two-state solution is dead. I think for me it's been dead for many, many years. It starts wounding me up on the inside when we talk about population growth, demographic threats, because my family's Palestinians living in what is now Israel. So are we, and I constantly make the comparison of when we talk about population growth of Jews in New York, it becomes racist. When we talk about population growth of Palestinians in Israel, it's acceptable. We're a demographic threat. The labels we've used are really misapplied in a racist ways towards Palestinians. But I understand where your question is going. I know that's not your intention. I wanted to clarify that because we constantly use these terms.